Mesopotamian, the beard. Byzantine, the mosaics. Aegean. Medieval, saw it today. Aegean. There's sure a lot of answers around the room. Okay, this is the King Midas's palace at Mycenae with the tapered columns that were out of wood and the rounded caps.
So what was it?
It was Aegean. Okay, this is what? The lamb and the shepherd being Etruscan. Early Christian is the symbol of the Christ figure with the lamb on the shoulder. The lamb down here, it looks more like a chicken over on the left rather than I think it's another lamb. Medieval manuscript. Egyptian. Medieval, stained glass. Early Christian. Okay, clear the machine.
Is on Romanesque architecture. Put in the first slide, please. Looking back over the ground we have covered so far, we might be struck by the fact that almost all of our headings of the lectures might equally serve as well for general history of civilization. Some of them might be based on technology, geography, ethnology, or religion, or whatever the source, but they do not designate artistic styles. There are only two exceptions. The archaic and the classical are really primary terms of styles, and they refer to qualities of form rather than the setting in which these forms were created. It would seem in the field of art history that more terms of this sort would have been designated for our earlier antiquity periods. But terms of style generally mean an aesthetic movement gradually centralizing on a central theme. And this has really only happened, with the exception of the classical period of the Greek from Pericles to Alexander the Great, only in the last 900 years. So before that, where most of the styles came from an indigenous form located within each area, it is best to label them from that area rather than of a certain style. The Romanesque style is one of sort of a contrast. It sprang up all over Western Europe at about the same time, and it consists of a large variety of regional styles, distinct yet closely related in many ways, but without a central source. It sort of resembles the art of the Dark Ages rather than of the court styles that preceded it. But what welded all of these different components together into a coherent style during the second half of the 11th century was not any single force, but a variety of factors. There was a growing spirit of religious enthusiasm reflected in the greatly increased pilgrimage traffic to sacred sites and culminating from 1095 on in the Crusades to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Equally important was the reopening of Mediterranean trade routes by the navies of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, and the revival of commerce and manufacturing. The most conspicuous difference between Romanesque architecture and that of the preceding centuries is the amazing increase in building activity. New towns sprang up everywhere. And especially from the 11th century on, the cities that had decreased in size during the Dark Ages. For instance, Rome, that was about 1 million population in 300 AD, fell to less than 50,000 at one point. But the reemergence of these cities, and especially along the routes of the pilgrimages, became a great factor in the development of this Romanesque style of church. An 11th century monk, Raoul Glaber, summed it up well when he triumphantly exclaimed that the world was putting on a white mantle of churches. These churches were not only more numerous than those of the early Middle Ages, but they were also generally larger, more richly articulated, and more Roman-looking. For their naves now had vaults instead of wooden roofs, and their exteriors, unlike those of early Christian Byzantine churches, were decorated with both architectural ornament and sculpture. Geographically, Romanesque monuments of the first importance are distributed over an area that might have well represented the world. Slide, please. Saint Sernin, in the southern French town of Toulouse, is one of a group of great churches of the pilgrimage type, so called because they were built along the road leading to the pilgrimage center of Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. The plan immediately strikes us as very much more complex and more fully integrated than those of earlier structures. It is an emphatic Latin cross with the center of gravity at the eastern end. Clearly, this church was not designed to serve a monastic community only, but like the old St. Peter's in Rome, to accommodate large crowds of lay worshippers in its long nave and transept. Slide, please. One immediately notices the grandeur achieved through the verticality of the side columns as they arch over the top of the nave. There are two side aisles to this structure, ending up in the ambulatory that once was underground so the pilgrims could circle around the crypts of the different saints. This has been brought up to the ground level so that the passage through this church and around the altar is a free-flowing pattern for the pilgrims to stop and make their pilgrimage on their way to the different holy centers. This is a massive church. You get a marvelous vertical effect, and yet it's a heavy feeling to the structure. We term Romanesque those churches before we get into the Gothic period, where the Romanesque was sort of solid, heavy, massive. The Gothic then tends to be very light, delicate, and airy. Especially in this of St. Sernin's in Toulouse, we show how much influence the old Roman style has on the interior of the churches, almost like a facade of the Colosseum in Rome, where they break it off into different horizontal bands, the use of the pilasters as decoration, the continuing effort of the repeating design as it finally leads your eye down toward the altar end, which is now, the apse is greatly obscured by this sort of overly decorated altar that was placed in at a later date. Slide, please. Many of the churches, as it sprang up, were influenced by local tastes and styles. San Miniato in Florence is a very early Romanesque style church with Byzantine decorations on the interior, sort of a transition piece. Whereas the older Byzantine churches, even of the basilica plan, were left completely plain on the exterior. San Miniato, on a tall hill overlooking the city of Florence, is highly decorated in the northern Tuscany style of breaking up the facade with different inlays of marbles. They use this dark terre verte or green marble to a great degree, almost an optical illusion geometric pattern. The outer exterior, the facade of this church, as you walk up these many flights of stairs to an open courtyard that is above our eye level here, and we can only see the top portion of the door. The facade is broken up in a repeated pattern of nice, neat arches, very similar to the Romans' use of the same arch. Basically, in a simplified Romanesque plan, you have the tall nave, or the central portion of the church. Then you have the two slanting roofs on either side that form the side aisles, or the traffic pattern of the church. Slide, please. The interior of this church is richly decorated. This is a Byzantine mosaic in a Romanesque structure. As I said, San Miniato is a very early church, and we still have the beamed and coffered ceiling that is done away with in the later, more splendid versions of the Romanesque structure. Slide, please. And this one, the ambulatory, as you see it going around the altar to the bottom side, is clearly visible. The altar is placed in the central portion of the church, and this is the old basilica plan. It's just a boxcar shape. It doesn't have the transept or the forming the arms of the cross. And then the choir area is up above and toward the back, so that they would even have a higher altar under the apse end of the church farther back. Slide, please. The patterns are rich, decorated, many variations within the church, and the beauty of the plan and the interior decorations of San Miniato. Most of it inlays of different colored marbles. The use of the Corinthian column holding up the pulpit near the choir loft. Slide, please. The exterior of the Romanesque church in the early stages resembles very much the early Christian churches. Although instead of just sort of happenings of patterns on the brick, we see now in this tower, and the towers were usually sort of stumped at the top. They did not rise gracefully, as we will see the later Gothic spires sort of reaching toward the heavens. Most of the Romanesque churches were of brick construction, and then the later churches that grow more elaborate have marble facades attached to them. And we will find within the brick facades of these churches these little sort of pierced square holes sort of scattered over the surface. These were for later date armatures to hold the marble to the original wall of the church. Slide, please. We also have some nice decoration and sculpture that we will talk about in our next lecture that accompanies the Romanesque style. We will see a few things of it. Most of the decoration within Romanesque churches is confined to small areas. Many times the ceilings in the later grander churches were decorated with murals, but most of the decorations we find in column caps, such as the ones supporting the side walls. The basic structure of the Romanesque church were two heavy side walls with the apse end of the church, and then these side walls were punctured with these repeating series of arches as it walks down the nave section of the church. Slide, please. One of the distinct styles of the northern Italian churches is this combination use of the different colored marbles, the banding that sort of frames the openings of the arches. Slide, please. Many of these churches, as there were pilgrim stops along the way, are quite bare of ornament. They're austere, they're massive, sort of heavy in feeling. And it wasn't really until the 12th century, the 1100s, that you really had the competency in technical structure to be able to span great areas and the decorative devices to embellish the interiors of the churches. Slide, please. Another one of the forms of the Romanesque church would be the central nave, and then where we had the two sloped side aisles before, these are replaced in the facade by two sort of short columns or tower structures on either side. You will always have the Roman arch piercing the walls in sort of a repeating design, especially in this one as you see the tiny arches in the band circling the tower top. Slide, please. Probably one of the most elaborate of all the Romanesque churches is the cathedral at Pisa, which is known much more for its campanile or bell tower than it is for the cathedral itself. It is a large structure, very elaborate, and from this side view we see how the Romanesque architect has used the old Roman style of the repeating arches, using the pilasters or the half columns plastered to the edge of the wall that really serve no function as structure or support, but are placed there as pure decoration. This church is built on the Roman cross again, with the extended nave to accompany the travelers coming into the church, and the crowd sort of centralizing around the dome structure that is right at the transept or the cross, or the two arms of the cross, so that people can gather in and watch the worship services. Slide, please. The interior is very massive and heavy looking, again with the northern Italian style of the bandings of different colors of marble. The columns are Corinthian, and many of the columns on the exterior of the church are each of a different size and type of marble, making it very decorative. Slide, please. The facade of the church is also very regimented in style. The repeating series of little arches with the columns, again the repeating arches over the doorways, and the massive bronze doors that are opened only on the greatest religious occasions. Many times in Romanesque churches you will have an extended facade over the front, as we will see at the church in Lucca, which makes a very impressive facade, even though for a smaller church on the interior. Slide, please. But what really has become the most famous part of the church at Pisa, the cathedral, is the campanile. Now, the bell tower of most of the Romanesque churches, unless they were of the type where the two towers flanked the nave on the facade, were separate structures. And in this one, started around 1150, the ground and the foundation started to sink at a very early period, and construction was stopped. They had reached about the third ring level when the foundation started to go. Construction was stopped for about a 25-year period, and the tower was not completed until another architect took over and redesigned the tower so that it counterbalanced the weight and slightly curved back toward the lean. Even the bells were placed in on the top of the tower so that the weight would displace the lean to the tower. Slide, please. In this, looking at it, you can almost see the slight curvature of the tall tower. There is a central core or shaft that goes all the way down through the center of the tower. There's a circular stairway that is just inside the shell wall, and then the decorative repeating Romanesque arches in the different bands as it proceeds up to the top smaller ring that holds the bells. Everything has been done to try to secure the foundation, but all historians say eventually gravity will pull it over. Slide, please. It's an intriguing tower as you walk up the 193 steps to the top ring, and then you have to walk up another series to get to the upper level. Because you're walking in a circular motion, you really don't know which side you're on. And then all of a sudden, the pull of the downside sort of makes climbing the steps very easy. And then as you go up the leaning side, the same height step becomes very difficult. And you're almost sort of thrown around in a gravity pattern. Slide, please. From the top of the tower, looking down at the apse end of the church, we see the repeating pattern of the arches resting on the columns. And then in the second and the third level of the apse end, you see a different type marble being used for each column, which gives a very highly decorative effect. Slide, please. The church at Pisa is so late that it almost, within the dome structure, looks Gothic, of where you get a fine, lacy, decorative effect to the fretwork surrounding the base of the dome. And the baptistry, which is in a separate octagonal building at the front of the cathedral, slide please, has a lot of, even though it's basically Romanesque in style, the upper sections have so much decoration on it that it almost becomes Gothic, especially with the pointed arches over the pointed rooftops over the arches. This has a beautiful echo effect. It's a large baptistry. I would imagine about 100 feet across. And the echo is so beautiful that when a word is spoken in a pronounced voice, it will have a lasting effect of about 5 to 6 seconds. The guard in there delights into singing notes in the scale, and then they all are singing in harmony with each other as the echo lasts that length of time. Slide, please. Other examples of Romanesque architecture more or less follow the same pattern. In this one, the towers are at the apse end of the church, but always you have these tiny repeating arches within the facade and within the towers of the church. Slide, please. On the interior, you have the two massive side walls that support the main nave or roof of the church. The two smaller side aisles are really sort of a buttress to hold up the force of the weight of the roof on these tall inner walls. Many times the pilasters or columns then form the vaulting directly over the top of the roof to give this sort of extended vertical feeling. And then, of course, the roof was built on the outside of the usually a pointed gable-type roof built over these round arches. In some cases, the columns or the pilasters stopped at the tall structure of the nave, and then a barrel vault thrown over that was left plain that was painted in fresco. Slide, please. Slide, please. To show you how sophisticated they can get, there was usually a second story or ambulatory at a gallery level where dignitaries or people of high position could be placed and in the privacy of these second floor galleries watch the services. Slide, please. This is a side aisle in the church in Durham in England. As you can tell, the Romanesque styles flowed all over Western Europe. Slide, please. Slide, please. Many of the great Romanesque churches built so early and not quite on the grandest of scales that people felt religion should obtain in the 13th and 14th centuries were either added onto or destroyed or changed in some way, so that many of the Romanesque structures are only sort of archaeological plans. Many of them were changed into Gothic churches at a later date. The Church of St. Sebald's in Nuremberg in Germany started out as a very humble little Romanesque church, and through the centuries grew into a very grand Gothic structure. Very little of the Romanesque is left in that church. Slide, please. As with some of the Byzantine art, it is so beautifully integrated within the structure of the Byzantine church, so is the Romanesque sculpture integrated in with its style whenever it's done. In St. Magdalene, the main portal is so beautifully decorated with the figure of Christ above a double door opening with a slightly pointed arched opening. The sculpture of the Romanesque style follows fairly closely the early Christian style of the sarcophagi. The figures are still sort of small in scale, but it has a great spirit to it. Slide, please. As in the Church of St. Lazarus, where you have almost a Gothic feeling in the spire that you see at the apse end of the church. It is a Romanesque structure with a tall spire instead of a dome, and then the two shorter towers at the front end of the church. In the Church of St. Lazarus, we have some beautiful Romanesque sculptures. Slide, please. Most of these are column cap decorations. And we will look into these a little more closely, looking at the medieval and Romanesque sculpture. Slide, please. In One of the Damned Falling into Hell. It's a stylized pattern that sort of takes the spirit of the early Christian art and adds sophistication of the Byzantine. Slide, please. The later churches got so grand that they had to add the buttress wall, as you can see in this night view, to hold up the nave walls. This, of course, in the more northern countries where they were piercing the side walls with more openings, was a main factor in the development of the Gothic structure. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Most of the churches in Europe do not have fixed pews as our churches in the United States do. They're either movable or the people bring them in as they enter the church, and then they're removed during the week. Slide, please. This is one with painted ceiling decorations. The columns are all of a sudden stop at that top level, and then the barrel vault is thrown over the two tops of the columns. In many cases, you don't find it so much in Romanesque art, but especially in Gothic, of where the architect was trying to build a most massive structure, and they did not know really how high they could go. You have a very squatty effect in Romanesque architecture. But many times they would build as high as they possibly could and then span it. Sometimes they built too high and the whole thing would crash down and they would just start over again. Slide, please. One of the most beautiful small Romanesque churches is in Verona, the Church of San Zeno. It has some beautiful early 11th century bronze doors. But the smaller church, this one has never received its marble facade. Again, the central nave, the small portico, many times lion figures sort of guarding the entrance to the church at the base of the portico. And then the central nave pierced by a round gondola-type window that then later grew in the Gothic church into the massive, beautiful rose windows. Slide, please. San Zeno is a fairly small church. Slide, please. The bronze doors, which are done individually and cast, and it tells the story of the Bible, are then placed on large wooden doors. Later on, when the techniques of casting became more known and the techniques refined, the whole doors then would be cast in bronze. Slide, please. Some of them get quite ornate, but the same basic pattern of the tall central nave and the repeating arch pattern is the characteristic of Romanesque architecture. Slide, please. Slide, please. Clear the machine.
For the review, we'll start back with Egyptian architecture. Each of our cultures have been divided into three basic areas: the architecture, sculpture, and decorative arts. In Egypt, you had the pyramids, and you had their temples with the capitals based on nature forms. Slide. In their wall paintings, it was flat patterned. The figure you saw from the frontal view, the face usually side view, and then you saw both the arms. Slide. And the use of earth pigments, and then you had hieroglyphics that filled the space between the figures. They were on a baseline. Slide. In the Mesopotamian sculpture, you don't have much of the architecture left except some examples of their relief brick walls or their entrances to their city. These were glazed and colored. Slide. One of the most delightful of the art forms, although it's fairly violent, were the palace relief carvings showing the conquest of the different kings. Even though the subject matter was violent, the technique was very delicately done. Slide. In the Aegean culture, you had the Cycladic figures, which were the small limestone carved, very abstract, simplified female shape. Slide. In the pottery, you had utilitarian pottery that had fanciful nature designs in sort of a free-flowing design covering the surface of the pottery. Slide. In the architecture, you had the beehive tombs and you had the palace at Minos with the unique column formation of the tapered column with the mushroom cap. Slide, please. In the Greek, or the archaic Greek period, and this is a later vase, you had the vase paintings that ended in 350 BC, but the earlier ones were very geometric, and then they worked in the orange, the terracotta against the black, or the black against the terracotta, and then later on in a late piece like this, where you would have a very defined line drawing scratched into the surface of the pottery. But these were not utilitarian, they were for burial purposes. Slide. In the archaic sculpture, it's very stiff, very formalized, very stylized. You have the archaic smile on the face. Slide. In the architecture, you have the development of the three Greek orders, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The Doric being the most simple, but it's the proportions that they believed so greatly in their post and lintel form of construction. Slide. In the classic sculpture, you have the figure first at rest and then in movement, but in these ideal proportions that the different sculptors formed to designate the gods and goddesses. Slide. In the Etruscan, you have two art forms: the wall paintings that decorated the underground tombs, which show a very happy, lyrical group of people, again on the baseline, no atmosphere, they're flat pattern, but very sort of curving rhythmical lines. Slide, please. And the other art form was the portrait of the reclining figure on top of the coffin. Slide, please. The Romans introduced the arch, they enabled them to span greater areas. They also used brick construction since they did not have the stone that the Greeks had. But with the arch, they were able to be much more imaginative in their architecture, in their plan. Slide. They also introduced portraiture in their arts. They used wall painting, but introduced it for the purpose of sort of like scenic views, of expanding the views within an enclosed space. Slide, please. Slide, please. The early Christians decorated the catacombs or the tombs with scenes from the Bible or teachings from Christianity, and their main theme was man overcoming great obstacles through faith. And they also, slide please, in their sarcophagi carved the delightful scenes with stories from the Bible. Not being taught academically, they only had the Greek and Roman statues to sort of go by. The artists were self-taught in that sense of the word. But they had sort of a great technique, but the figure became much, much smaller, not stretched out as in the classic Greek period. And of course, it had the story of the Bible. Slide. Then the development, the break around 540 AD in Constantinople, the great church of Santa Sophia, of where instead of the arch or the dome being on a round drum, the weight rests on the four corners, which allows for a much greater freedom of space, with windows being able to be put into the walls in between the supports. Slide, please.